Hi there, and welcome back to another installment of the Fashion Alphabet. This week we're covering V, and that means, of course, we're talking all about Vivienne Westwood. She would carve a place for herself as the matriarch of punk fashion here in London, as well as fighting back against what she perceived as the iconoclasm of the 20th century fashion scene. She would infuse her work with ideas about sex and gender, drawing her inspiration directly from London's sexual subcultural scene. But before I get ahead of myself, my name is Andrew Millar. I'm a visitor host here at the Museum of London. And before we head down into the archives to take a closer look at some of Westwood's pieces, I would be remiss if I didn't draw attention to the Westwood that we actually have here on display in our World City Gallery. This jacket and skirt ensemble designed for men was debuted as part of the 1983 Witches collection, and the skirt would later be owned and worn by clothes designer and cross-dresser Dane Golding throughout the 80s. In 1995, Westwood would affirm her belief that fashion is all about playing with the polarities of masculine and feminine. Fashion is eventually about being naked. And in loose-fitting ensembles like this one, Westwood is drawing our attention towards the body and anticipating the act and ease of undressing the wearer. But this is the Fashion Alphabet, so without further ado, we're going to cut away to our dress and textile store downstairs and see if we can't rustle up some more iconic pieces of Westwood's clothing. So here in the dress and textile store at the Museum of London, our wonderful fashion curators have managed to procure for us one of the ensembles that was worn by Dane Golding. The Pirate Collection in 1981 was the debut catwalk show of Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren. Westwood would cite the influence of the French Revolution, African patterns, and Victorian dandies for her work on the Pirate Collection, so called because of how it plundered the ideas and colours of history. If we want to take a closer look at these cotton trousers here, we see that they have the asymmetrical cut and that they are very loose-fitting around the pelvis. And in both of these things, again, we see how Vivienne Westwood is playfully making a relationship between the kind of fabrics hanging off of the body, the loose-fitting aesthetic. And indeed, again, with the cotton sash that would have been paired to kind of bring the entire ensemble together, we see all these loose fabrics being drawn back in towards the contours of the body around the waist. So we see with these two outfits that Westwood was participating in a much larger conversation about how fashion was rapidly transitioning throughout the 20th century in Britain. For Westwood, sex and gender were in, and fashion was their playground. And if this wasn't obvious enough already, one only had to stop in at the shop that she and Malcolm McLaren opened at 430 Kings Road in Chelsea in 1974. Although the shop would rebrand several times, this first iteration between 1974 and 76 was boldly named Sex. So we're getting quite a clear idea of what Westwood's design agenda of the time was. The same building continues to celebrate Westwood's influence on the London fashion scene, having been rebranded and opened as World's End in 1980. So you might have noticed, and it's no accident, that the two outfits that we're looking at this week for Vivienne Westwood were both acquired and at one time worn by Dane Golding. Golding was a true disciple of Westwood and McLaren, and he really embraced their design ethos as enabling him to dress in a way which he found freeing and even empowering in the 1980s. In speaking to the Museum of London in 2004 regarding its exhibition The London Look, Golding stated that he grew up being really frustrated with the aesthetic limitations imposed on him just because he was male, not understanding why his sister got all the interesting stuff. Golding would go on to state that he really owed a huge debt to Miss or Mrs. Westwood, stating, "I honestly never wore her clothes to look cute. I always felt I was commenting on a world I was really unhappy with." We can actually see this ethos of self-expression through Westwood's fashion and how Golding would later modify the outfit for his own personal use. These metal studs across the waistcoat were added by Golding when he was wearing the outfit, and we can actually see, if we look closer, that the studs crossed directly through the label of World's End, the shop as it then was opened by Vivienne Westwood on King's Road. It's a really, really interesting example of how the narrative and the story of the outfit continued long after it debuted on the runway in 1981. With this ensemble, we really see the transformative power of Westwood's clothing for Golding, for London, and far, far beyond. Thank you so much for joining me for this instalment of the Fashion Alphabet. Be sure to stay tuned. We still have a few more letters to go. So do check in with us next time to find out what's going to be happening with the letter W.